The Alaskan night was never truly silent. It breathed through the wind whispering in the spruce trees, through the crackle of the frozen lake, through something ancient that lived just beyond the firelight. Inside a small log cabin, the world felt safe and small. The scent of burning pine filled the room, and the orange glow of the fire danced across old wooden walls. 10-year-old Evan sat near the hearth, wrapped in a wool blanket that was far too big for him. The shadows moved like living things, and every now and then he glanced nervously toward the window. Then it came a sound so deep it seemed to rise from the earth itself. A long, echoing howl rolled through the valley, shaking the silence apart. Evan froze. "Grandpa, are they close?" he whispered. His grandfather Thomas looked up from the wood stove. Years of wilderness had carved lines into his face, but his eyes still held the calm of someone who had learned to listen to the wild instead of fearing it. He smiled, slow and gentle. "Close enough to talk to each other," he said softly. "Not to hurt us." Evan clutched his blanket tighter. The howl came again, this time answered by another farther away, like two voices calling across the cold. To him, it sounded like warning cries, ghosts moving through the trees. But to Thomas, it was something else entirely, a conversation between family members, making sure no one was lost in the dark. The fire popped, and for a while, that was the only sound between them. Thomas leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the frosted window. "Wolves don't howl to frighten," he said almost to himself. "They howl to find each other." Evan didn't answer. He was still listening, but something inside him had changed, a seed of curiosity planted where fear had lived a moment before. Outside, the wind carried another howl. It was softer this time, almost melodic. Evan whispered, "It doesn't sound angry anymore." Thomas smiled without looking away from the window. "That's because it isn't." The boy's gaze followed the flicker of firelight up the cabin walls, landing on a framed photograph, a younger Thomas standing beside another ranger, both smiling, both surrounded by endless forest. Beneath the photo, a carved wooden wolf sat on the mantel, its snout tilted toward the ceiling as if frozen mid-song. Evan stared at it, feeling something stir, not fear, but wonder. Outside, the howls rose again, drifting through the valley like threads of silver in the air. He could almost imagine them weaving through the trees, over the frozen lakes, across the ridges, voices making sure no one was alone. For the first time, he wanted to listen, not hide. Thomas noticed the shift in his grandson's face. He reached over and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, rough but warm. "You'll understand one day," he said quietly. "Every sound in this forest means something, even the ones that scare you." The fire burned low. The wind sighed through the chimney. Evan's eyes grew heavy, but the last thing he heard before sleep took him was the gentle rise and fall of the wolves' song, echoing across the frozen night. Out there in the darkness, something wild was speaking, and for the first time in his life, the boy listened. But he didn't yet know, before the summer ended, the wolves would answer him back. Morning came quietly in Alaska. The sun broke over the mountains in slow golden bands, melting the thin layer of frost that had formed on the cabin windows. Evan woke to the smell of coffee and the distant sound of ravens. His grandfather was already outside splitting firewood, with smooth, measured swings, each strike echoing across the clearing. The boy pushed open the cabin door, the cold air biting his cheeks. Thomas looked up and grinned. "Morning, city boy," he said. "You sleep through the concert last night." Evan smiled shyly. "You mean the wolves?" Thomas nodded, resting his axe against the stump. "They're early this year. Means the salmon are moving. The packs follow the rivers when the ice starts to break." Evan stepped closer, his boots crunching on the frost. "Were they always here? Near your cabin?" Long before me, Thomas replied, looking toward the tree line. Before your mother was born, before I even built this place. You don't live out here. You share space with everything else that calls it home. He handed Evan a mug of cocoa, the steam rising into the cold. For a while they stood together in silence, watching a hawk glide above the treetops. The forest seemed endless rivers, glinting like ribbons of light mountains, fading into pale blue haze. To Evan, it felt like another world so far from Seattle, from screens, from the constant hum of traffic. Here, the loudest sound was the heartbeat of the land itself. That afternoon, Thomas took him on a walk down the old ranger trail. The snow was soft under their boots, and every few steps, Thomas stopped crouching to show something on the ground. Elk tracks, hair prints, the claw marks of a black bear that had passed weeks before. Every trail tells a story, he said, tracing a paw print with his finger. If you learn to read them, the forest talks back. Evan studied the print. It was larger than his hand, 4 perfect pads in the snow. Wolf, he asked. Thomas smiled. Good eye. They followed the tracks for a while, but the prints eventually disappeared into a frozen stream. Thomas pointed toward the ridge. They probably went up that way toward the den sites. Don't worry, they'll smell us long before we ever see them. Evan wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. They sat on a fallen log near the creek unwrapping sandwiches. The forest was still except for the whisper of running water beneath the ice. Thomas took a slow breath, as if the air itself was a memory. I used to come out here every week, he said. When I was a ranger, this whole valley was my patrol route. Back then, wolves were fewer. People were afraid of them. Some still are. Evan looked up. Were you afraid too? Thomas shook his head. No, I was angry at how misunderstood they were. Most of the time they stayed far from people. They only came close when their prey moved, or when snow made food scarce. But fear makes people forget that. He glanced at the boy, his eyes gentle but serious. Wolves are not villains. They're caretakers of balance. Take them away, and the forest changes too many deer-sick elk rivers drying up. They're part of the heartbeat. Evan listened quietly, his cocoa growing cold in his hands. He thought of the howls last night, how lonely they had sounded. Maybe they weren't monsters after all. Maybe they were families just like people. On their way back to the cabin, they passed a weathered wooden sign half buried in snow, Alaska Range Wildlife Preserve. The letters were faded, but the words carried weight. Thomas stopped beside it, brushing off the frost. Rules still matter, he said. No traps, no baiting, no feeding. The best way to love something wild is to let it stay wild. That evening the cabin came alive again with the rhythm of quiet living. Thomas cooked trout he'd caught from the nearby stream, and Evan helped by setting the table. As the firelight flickered, the old ranger began telling stories of blizzards survived, of lost hikers, found, of wolves glimpsed only by their tracks. Once Thomas said, his voice low and thoughtful, I followed a pack for 3 weeks. Never saw them, not once. But I heard them every night. They kept just far enough ahead like they knew I was there, and they didn't want trouble. He leaned back, eyes reflecting the fire. The night I finally turned back, I howled just once for the fun of it. And they answered. All of them. The whole forest came alive. I'll never forget that sound. Evan stared at him, awed. They answered you. Thomas smiled faintly. Maybe they were laughing at me. Maybe they were saying goodbye. Doesn't matter. It reminded me that we're not alone out here. We're just guests passing through their home. Later that night, when the world outside went dark again, Evan stood by the window. The moonlight painted the snow in shades of blue and silver. Somewhere far off, another howl began soft rising, then fading into the trees. This time, the boy didn't hide. He listened. and deep inside, he felt something shift, a quiet understanding, like the forest was speaking in a language only his heart could hear. He didn't know it yet, but that was the night the wilderness began to trust him back. The next morning began with a pale sun and the quiet hum of wind sliding through the spruce trees. Evan was sitting on the porch steps, tracing shapes in the frost with a stick. His grandfather had gone to check the traps near the river, not for wolves, but for snow damage on the water lines. The world around him was so still, he could hear his own breath. From somewhere far away came the slow rhythm of ice cracking on the lake, the groan of an ancient world shifting under the weight of winter. And then it came again, the sound. A howl, long and low, floating across the trees. Evan froze. It was closer this time. Not far like before, this one was near. He looked toward the ridge where the spruce grew thick and the ground dipped into a hollow valley. The sound had come from there. His heart pounded. He remembered his grandfather's words. They howl to find each other, not to hurt us. Still, curiosity tugged harder than fear. He pulled on his jacket and stepped off the porch and step crunching softly through the snow. The air smelled sharp and clean like pine and frozen earth. A crow cawed somewhere overhead, flapping from branch to branch. He followed the faint trail Thomas had made earlier, his boots sinking deeper with each step. For the first time he noticed the details: broken twigs, faint paw prints pressed into the soft crust of snow. 4 pads, straight gait. Wolf. His breath quickened. He wasn't sure whether to turn back or keep going. The forest was both beautiful and endless, and in that vastness he felt very small. Then through the mist between the trees he saw movement. At first it was only a shadow, a shape gliding silently between the trunks. Then the shadow stopped, and 2 amber eyes blinked through the cold light. A wolf. It stood maybe 30 yards away, perfectly still, its breath visible in the freezing air. Its coat was gray with streaks of silver blending into the winter landscape. For a moment, neither of them moved. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Evan's chest tightened. His first instinct was to run. But the animal wasn't growling, wasn't baring its teeth. It just watched him, curious, calm. He remembered what his grandfather had said the night before. Every sound in this forest means something. The wolf tilted its head slightly, ears twitching. Then, almost imperceptibly, it lifted its muzzle and let out a short, soft whine. Not the haunting howl he'd heard at night, but a low, questioning sound. Evan swallowed hard. Without thinking, he whispered, "Hi." The sound came out small, clouded in his breath. But the wolf didn't move. It blinked slowly, then stepped forward, one cautious step, then another. And then it stopped. From somewhere deeper in the forest, another howl rose higher, longer, and the wolf's ears perked instantly. It turned toward the sound, its entire body alert. Then, before Evan could even blink, it was gone, melting back into the trees like smoke in wind. Evan stood frozen, heart hammering, the silence ringing in his ears. When he finally turned around, he saw his grandfather coming up the trail, carrying a small bundle of firewood. Thomas's face shifted from surprise to concern. "Evan, what in the world are you doing out here alone?" Evan pointed toward the trees, words tumbling out. "Grandpa, I saw one, a real wolf. Right there. It looked at me. It didn't even growl." Thomas set the wood down, scanning the tree line. "You sure?" "Yes," Evan said, his voice trembling but full of awe. "It was gray. And its eyes, they looked right through me." Thomas didn't scold him. Instead, he crouched down to meet the boy's eyes. "Then you're lucky," he said softly. "Most people go their whole lives and never meet one up close, not like that." Evan's voice dropped. It wasn't scary. "I thought it would be, but it wasn't." Thomas smiled, though his eyes carried something deeper respect. Because you listened before you judged. That's the first lesson the forest teaches. He looked toward the trees one last time, as if the wolf might still be watching. You didn't chase it, didn't shout. You let it choose to be near you. That's why it stayed. Evan nodded slowly, his breath forming tiny clouds in the cold air. For the rest of the walk home, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. That night after dinner, the boy couldn't sleep. He sat by the window again, the same place he'd been afraid to look before. The moon hung low over the valley, silver light spreading across the snow. Then came the sound, one long, haunting note rising from somewhere far away. Evan smiled. He didn't know whether it was the same wolf he'd seen earlier, but something about the call felt different, like a voice he finally understood. In that moment, he realized what his grandfather had been trying to teach him all along. The wild doesn't speak our language, but it listens when we do. He whispered softly into the night, "Good night." And from deep in the forest, the wilderness answered. Days passed, and the rhythm of life in the forest found its way into Evan's heart. Every morning, he helped Thomas gather wood or check the traps for snow damage. Every evening, as the light faded and the cold crept in, he waited for the same thing, the moment when the first howl rose from the hills. What had once chilled him now drew him to the porch like a magnet. Thomas would sit beside him, bundled in his old ranger coat, his breath visible in the lamplight. The forest around them pulsed with life, the whisper of branches, the rustle of small animals beneath the snow, and above all that familiar sound low and far carried by the wind. "The lead wolf starts," Thomas said one night, his voice quiet, and the rest answer. "It's how they know everyone's still there." Evan nodded slowly, eyes wide. "Like a roll call." Thomas chuckled. "Something like that." He took a sip of coffee, then added, "The long howls, those are the far ones. The short ones mean they're close. Listen carefully, and you can tell how big the pack is." The boy leaned forward, straining to hear. The forest responded, a second call, this time closer, and then another almost overlapping. A chorus rising in layers, weaving across the valley like a song older than words. Evan whispered, "It sounds beautiful." Thomas smiled. "It is. People call it haunting, but to me, it's harmony." That night after the wolves grew quiet, Evan couldn't stop thinking about the sounds, the timing, the pattern, the rhythm. He even tried to imitate them softly before bed, letting the sound hum in his throat until he drifted to sleep. The days grew colder. Snow fell heavier now, thick flakes spinning like feathers in the wind. One morning, they woke to find the entire world buried beneath a foot of white. The cabin creaked under its weight, and the trees stood cloaked in silence. It was during this time that Thomas began teaching Evan what he called the language of survival. He showed him how to follow tracks without getting lost, how to tell direction by the way the moss grew on tree bark, and how to listen, not just hear, but listen. "Everything out here is speaking," Thomas said, crouched beside a frozen stream. "The ice, the birds, even the silence. You just have to learn when it's talking to you and when it's warning you." Evan absorbed every word. He felt different now, braver, sharper, more connected. At night, when the wolves called, he began to answer softly under his breath, his voice small but sincere. At first, there was only silence. But one night, something changed. He and Thomas were sitting by the fire, the storm outside howling just as fiercely as the wolves themselves. The cabin lights flickered as the wind battered the windows. Evan looked up and said, "Grandpa, can they hear us if we howl back?" Thomas smiled. "Maybe. The sound carries far. But remember, we're guests here. Best to listen more than we speak." Still, When the next howl came, a deep, distant one, Evan couldn't resist. He cupped his hands and let out a soft, shaky imitation. Thomas turned toward him in surprise, then laughed quietly. "Not bad, kid. You've got the lungs for it." They waited. The storm roared. The fire popped. Then faintly from far across the valley came a reply. It was brief, almost uncertain, but it was there. Evan's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" Thomas listened. His face softened, caught between disbelief and pride. "I did." Evan grinned so wide it made his cheeks hurt. "They answered me." Thomas shook his head, smiling. "Maybe they did. Or maybe they just liked your tune." From that night on, their evenings changed. Each sunset, Evan would wait on the porch, watching the horizon fade into indigo. When the first howl began, he'd take a breath and mimic it carefully, never too loud, never too long. Sometimes there was no answer. Sometimes there was. But always the act of trying filled him with something deeper connection. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was part of the conversation. Weeks passed. The forest grew harsher, testing both man and boy. Food runs became more difficult. Once, when a blizzard trapped them indoors for 2 days, the firewood ran low. Thomas rationed every log, every ember, while Evan helped by melting snow for water and keeping watch for cracks in the cabin walls. Through the storm, the howls continued, sometimes close, sometimes fading into the wind, a reminder that the wolves, too, were enduring. Thomas told him stories to pass the time. "Did you know," he said one night, "wolves take turns guarding their young. When one hunts, another stays behind. They survive because they trust each other completely. That's what makes them strong." Evan listened, watching the old man's face lit by the fire. "Like you and me?" he asked softly. Thomas smiled. "Exactly like you and me." Something deep inside Evan shifted at those words. He realized that his grandfather wasn't just teaching him about wolves, he was teaching him about family, about loyalty, about what it means to look after one another, even when the world outside is cold and uncertain. The storm finally broke on the third night. The world outside glistened under a full moon, silver and still. Thomas opened the cabin door and stepped out, breathing deeply. "Smell that?" he asked. "Clean air. The forest always heals itself." Evan followed him to the porch. The snow sparkled like starlight. Then, as if on cue, a lone howl rose from the ridge. Without waiting, Evan tilted his head back and answered. The sound wasn't perfect, but it carried. Thomas chuckled softly beside him. Moments later, a second howl replied, closer this time. Then another. Evan's laughter echoed through the night, pure and free. For the first time, he felt like the forest knew his name. Thomas put an arm around his shoulders. "They're saying, 'Welcome back,'" he murmured. And in that quiet, glowing moment, man, boy, and wilderness, all three spoke the same language. The storm came in without warning. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of iron, heavy, low, endless. The wind, once a gentle hum through the pines, grew teeth. It clawed at the cabin, rattling the shutters, bending the old spruce trees until they groaned. Thomas knew what that sound meant. He'd lived through enough Alaskan winters to recognize the tone of danger carried in the wind. "Get the lanterns ready, Evan," he said, stacking logs into the fireplace. "This one's not gonna be gentle." By nightfall, the storm had swallowed everything. Snow hammered the roof like stones. The windows fogged white. The world outside vanished. The lights flickered once, twice, then died. Darkness rushed in, broken only by the trembling orange glow of the fire. Evan stood near the window, but all he could see was his reflection staring back. The sound of the wind roared so loud it drowned out thought. "Grandpa," he whispered, "are we going to be okay?" Thomas knelt beside him, steady as ever. "We're fine. Just a little power outage. The storm will pass." He struck a match and lit an oil lantern. The small flame bloomed, pushing the shadows back just enough to see the lines of worry etched on his weathered face. Then, from somewhere deep within the storm, a howl. It was close. Too close. Not the distant echo they'd grown used to, but a raw, trembling sound muffled by wind, yet unmistakable. Another answered it. Then another. Evan's breath hitched. "They're near the cabin." Thomas looked toward the window, his eyes reflecting the lantern light. "They're not hunting," he said calmly. "They're calling each other, probably scattered in the storm." But the boy wasn't convinced. The howls were different tonight, sharper, more urgent. It felt like the wilderness itself was alive and afraid. The old ranger rose, pulled on his coat, and grabbed another lantern. "Come on," he said. Evan blinked. "Where are we going?" "Just outside." Sometimes it helps to listen instead of hide. The door creaked open, and a wall of freezing air slammed into them. Snow whipped in spirals, biting their faces. They stepped onto the porch, the lantern light flickering wildly in the gale. Beyond the blur of white, the forest groaned under the storm's weight. Trees swayed like giants fighting to stay upright. And through it all came the chorus, a symphony of howls twisting and rising and breaking apart in the wind. Evan gripped his grandfather's sleeve. "They sound lost." Thomas nodded. "Maybe they are." He took a deep breath, then lifted his head toward the dark ridge and let out a low, steady howl. It wasn't loud, just strong enough to carry. The sound wove through the wind, a single note of calm in the chaos. Evan stared in disbelief. You howled." Thomas grinned faintly. "Sometimes you talk to the forest the only way it understands." For a moment, nothing answered, only the moan of the storm. Then, from the distance, a reply. Long, mournful, but clear. Evan's eyes widened. "They heard you." Thomas nodded, lantern trembling in his hand. "Your turn." The boy hesitated, then tilted his head back, heart pounding, and let out his best attempt. The sound cracked halfway through, part voice, part laugh, but it didn't matter. It was real. The storm swallowed it whole. For a long moment, only silence. Then, a single howl rose from the trees below, closer than before. Then another circling from the ridge. Evan gasped. "They're answering me." Thomas smiled. "They're saying they found each other. That's all." The boy's voice trembled. "How do you know?" "Because that's what we all do when we're scared," Thomas said softly. "We call out, hoping someone will answer." They stood there for a long while, man and boy wrapped in the storm's fury, lantern light flickering between them. Every time the wolves called, the sound seemed to draw nearer, not in threat, but in connection. The wind screamed through the valley, carrying with it a dozen howls overlapping, echoing, fading, returning. A wild orchestra of survival. And somewhere in the middle of it, Thomas began to laugh quietly. It was a warm, weary laugh, the kind that comes when you realize you're small, but part of something vast. Evan looked up at him. "Why are you laughing?" "Because Thomas said they're alive out there, even in this, even now." He knelt down, his face level with the boys. "That sound, remember it. That's what courage sounds like in the wild." The storm raged through the night, but the howls never stopped. They became a rhythm like the beating of the earth itself. Eventually, the cold forced them back inside. They shut the door, but the echoes followed them, wrapping the cabin in invisible company. Evan sat near the fire, still trembling, though not from fear. He couldn't stop smiling. They weren't lost, Grandpa. They were calling home. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. Exactly. Outside, the wind began to fade. The flames in the hearth danced softer now, the danger slowly retreating. Evan stared into the firelight, thinking of the wolves huddled somewhere out there, their calls carrying through the snow. The storm had made the world smaller, but somehow he felt more connected to it than ever. He whispered, "Do you think they remember us?" Thomas looked into the fire. "I think they remember kindness, just like we do." Hours later, when the storm finally broke, the valley lay silent beneath the moon. The snow shimmered untouched, infinite. The stars hung low, bright enough to paint shadows on the ground. And from deep within the forest, a single calm howl rose slow, peaceful like a sigh after surviving the night. Evan opened his eyes, listening from his bed. He smiled and whispered into the dark, "Good night, friend." This time, the forest didn't just echo his voice. It answered. When the storm finally broke, it left behind a world carved from glass. The forest shimmered under the morning sun, branches heavy with frost, the snow untouched except for a single trail of paw prints leading away from the ridge. Thomas stood on the porch, a mug of steaming coffee in hand, watching the breath of the earth rise like smoke. Evan joined him, scarf wrapped high around his face. "They made it," the boy whispered, pointing toward the tracks. Thomas smiled. "They always do. It should have been a peaceful morning." But before long, the growl of an engine broke the stillness. A snowmobile came winding up the trail, red loud, angry against the quiet white. The machine stopped in front of the cabin, and a man in a fur-lined parka pulled off his goggles. It was Cal Reed, a neighbor who lived 2 miles down the valley. He was a rancher, and one of the few people Thomas didn't see eye to eye with. "Morning." Tom Cal said, his voice tight with irritation. "You got wolves up here again." Thomas sighed. "Morning to you too." Cal pointed toward the tree line. "Saw 'em cross my lower pasture last night. Heard 'em too. Sounded like they were right behind my barn." Evan's eyes widened. "They don't hurt anyone," he said quickly. "They were just—" Cal cut him off with a sharp look. "Kid wolves don't need to hurt anyone to cause trouble. They scare the herd. That's enough." Thomas's tone stayed calm. "They're just passing through, Cal. Storm probably scattered them. They'll move on once the snow softens." But Cal wasn't listening. "You know what happens when people get too comfortable with predators? Someone loses a calf. Or worse. You ought to stop feeding into this nonsense before someone calls the wildlife office." Thomas straightened slightly. "I don't feed them. I don't bait them. I respect them same way I respect your herd." Cal frowned. "Well, respect doesn't keep livestock alive. Fear does." He revved his engine, the snow spraying white dust into the air. "You used to be a ranger, Tom. You should know better. People around here are starting to talk. They say the wolves come close 'cause they smell your garbage, or maybe your cabin feels safe." Thomas didn't answer. He just watched as Cal turned the snowmobile and roared away down the trail, leaving silence and exhaust behind. Evan stood still, fists tight in his mittens. Why does he hate them? Thomas exhaled slowly, eyes following the fading tracks. Because he's afraid, and fear makes people forget what they're part of. They went back inside. The fire was still warm, but the mood had changed. That evening, the radio crackled with local news reports of wolf sightings near town, ranchers demanding preventive measures, wildlife officers warning residents not to approach or leave food out. Evan listened quietly, then said, "Are they going to hurt them?" Thomas hesitated. "If the pack comes too close to livestock, maybe. That's the law, even if it's wrong." The boy frowned. "But they didn't do anything." "That's not always what matters to people," Thomas said softly. "Sometimes all it takes is a sound in the night." He looked out the window where the snow was beginning to fall again. When I was a ranger, I saw it happen more times than I care to remember. Folks hear wolves, they see shadows, and suddenly every missing calf becomes their fault. Evan shook his head. That's not fair. No, Thomas said, but it's human. A few days later, a white pickup from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game rolled into the clearing. 2 officers stepped out, their jackets marked with the state insignia. One of them, a woman named Rita Gomez, had worked with Thomas years ago. She smiled as she approached. Tom Hale, still out here talking to wolves? Thomas chuckled. Somebody's gotta listen. Her tone softened. We've had complaints, ranchers mostly. You know the drill sightings, noise fear. Just checking in. Evan stood beside his grandfather, anxious. They can't take the wolves away, right? Rita crouched slightly, meeting his eyes. We don't take them unless we have to. Wolves are protected in this region as long as they're not causing harm. But people get nervous. It's easier to blame what they don't understand. Thomas nodded. That's the problem. Always has been. She sighed, glancing toward the tree line. You'd be surprised how many folks think wolves howl just to scare them. They howl to stay together, Evan said quickly. Rita smiled. You've been learning from a good teacher. Before leaving, she handed Thomas a small packet pamphlets about coexisting with wildlife guidelines for reporting sightings. You might want to share these with your neighbors, she said with a knowing look. After the truck disappeared down the trail, Thomas sat on the porch steps, flipping through the papers. Funny, he murmured. It takes a whole department to remind people not to panic. Evan sat beside him. Why can't they just listen like we do? Thomas looked at him with quiet pride. Because, Evan, most people stop listening when they grow up. They start hearing what they fear instead of what's true. The wind picked up again, soft and cold. Somewhere far beyond the trees, a single howl rose steady, calm, unafraid. Evan smiled. They're still here. Thomas nodded. They always will be. The question is whether we'll still deserve to be. For a long moment, they sat in silence, 2 generations framed by the same wilderness, one remembering, one learning, both listening. That night, Evan wrote in his small notebook by the firelight. His handwriting was uneven, the words simple but true. People think wolves are dangerous because they howl. But maybe the danger isn't the sound. Maybe it's that we stopped answering. He looked up at his grandfather, who had fallen asleep in the chair, the fire painting his face in gold and shadow. Outside, the wolves called again, not warnings this time, but voices of life echoing through the valley. Evan closed his notebook and whispered to the night, "Don't worry, we hear you." And for a moment in the deep quiet of Alaska, it felt like the whole forest listened back. The days grew longer again. The snow began to soften, trickling into rivulets that whispered beneath the trees. Ravens returned to the sky, and the river thawed just enough for the sound of running water to return the heartbeat of the valley. Spring was coming, and with it, the end of Evan's stay. He knew it even before his grandfather said the words. The cabin had grown quieter lately, like it was listening, waiting for something to change. Every evening, the boy tried to memorize the way the forest sounded, the creak of the trees, the distant echo of wolves, the rhythm of life that had filled his days here. One morning, Thomas stood by the truck with a letter in his hand from Evan's mother. "She's coming next week," he said gently. "Time for you to head back to Seattle." Evan looked down, his hands buried in his coat pockets. Already Thomas smiled sadly. "You know how it goes. School friends, normal life." "But I like this life," Evan muttered. The old man laughed softly. "So did I. Still do." They spent that day repairing the cabin roof, cleaning the tools, stacking wood for next winter. The forest watched them quietly. Every now and then a faint howl would roll down the hills, not near but not far either. It was comforting, like an old friend reminding them it was still there. That night, after dinner, they sat together on the porch for what they both knew would be the last time. The air was cold but gentle, carrying the smell of thawing pine and melting snow. The horizon glowed with a thin ribbon of pink fading into blue. And then, as if on cue, a single howl rose from the ridge. Evan closed his eyes. "That's them." Thomas nodded. "They're saying good night." Evan hesitated. "Or goodbye." Thomas smiled. "Maybe both." For a while neither spoke. The howls came again, layered and melodic, weaving through the dark like threads of light. Evan listened until his chest ached, not from fear, but from something else, something heavier. He turned to his grandfather. "Can I answer one more time?" Thomas looked at him, the lantern glow catching the faint glimmer of tears in his eyes. "You should." Evan stood up, took a deep breath, and let his voice rise into the night. It wasn't perfect. It cracked, wavered, but it was full of everything he'd learned, the courage, the love, the understanding. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, faint and clear, a howl echoed back. Then another, and another. The whole forest answered. Evan's face lit up. He laughed through the tears that had started to fall, and Thomas wrapped an arm around his shoulders. Together they listened until the echoes faded into the stars. After a long silence, the old man spoke quietly. "Do you know what they're really saying?" Evan shook his head. "They're telling you it's okay to go. The wild doesn't hold grudges, it remembers hearts." The boy looked up at him, eyes bright. "Will they forget me?" Thomas smiled softly. "Not the ones who listen." The next morning, the valley was still. The frost clung to the grass like tiny mirrors. Evan packed his backpack slowly, pausing to take one last look at the cabin, the smell of wood smoke, the old fishing rods, the carved wolf on the mantel. He held the wooden carving in his hand. "Can I take it?" Thomas shook his head gently. "No, that one stays. But you can have this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pendant, a simple wooden wolf carved years ago. Its surface was smooth from being held too often, its edges worn by time. Evan took it, eyes wide. "You made this?" Thomas nodded. "Made it the day your mom was born. Guess it's your turn to keep it safe." The boy slipped it over his neck, the pendant resting warm against his chest. As they loaded the last bag into the truck, a soft sound drifted from the woods. Not a howl this time, but a short, low whine. Thomas froze, glancing toward the ridge. Through the fog, a gray figure stood watching. It was there only a moment, then vanished into the trees. Evan gasped. "Grandpa, that's—" Thomas smiled, hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "I know." Neither of them spoke as the truck rumbled down the trail. Evan looked back one last time, watching the cabin grow smaller, the forest swallowing it whole. Somewhere behind them, a final howl rose, long, steady, peaceful. It carried through the valley, over the snow, across the river, until it reached him, even as the road curved out of sight. Evan pressed the pendant against his chest, whispering, "I'll be back." And though the forest gave no answer, he could feel it listening. A full year passed before Evan saw Alaska again. He had grown taller, his face older in the quiet ways a boy's face changes when he begins to understand the world. Seattle had its noise and lights and busy streets, but none of it filled him like the wind in the pines once had. Sometimes late at night, when the city traffic died down, he would close his eyes and try to remember. The smell of wood smoke, the soft creak of the cabin floorboards, the sound of his grandfather's voice telling him, "Every sound in this forest means something." But what he missed most what lingered in his dreams was the howl. He still wore the small wooden wolf around his neck. Sometimes he'd touch it when things felt too loud or too far away, and in those moments, it was as if the forest was still with him, patient, listening, waiting. When summer came again, his mother drove him north up through the winding roads and mountain passes. The landscape changed from green to gold to white again as they reached the old valley. The cabin looked smaller now, tucked beneath the towering spruce, its roof patched neatly from last year's work. Thomas stood outside, waiting, his face lit by that same calm smile Evan had missed all year. "Welcome home," he said simply. Evan ran to him and hugged him tightly. That first night back, the world felt both new and familiar. The same creak of the porch, the same old coffee mug in Thomas's hand, the same smell of cedar smoke curling from the chimney. They sat together as the sun sank behind the ridge. The air was thick with mosquitoes and the hum of the river thawing. And then, like an echo from a forgotten dream, came the sound. A howl, long and low, rising from the valley below. Evan froze. "It's them." Thomas nodded, eyes glinting. "Maybe not the same ones, but they remember the place." The boy smiled. "It sounds softer than I remember." Thomas chuckled. "Maybe you're hearing it differently now." The wolves called again, not frantic, not distant, but calm, like a conversation across the valley. The sound rippled through the trees, brushing past the cabin, filling the night with something that wasn't loneliness, but belonging. Evan felt something shift deep in his chest. He wasn't the scared boy from last winter anymore. He wasn't even just a visitor. The forest had become a part of him. "Can I?" he asked quietly. Thomas nodded. "Go on." Evan tilted his head back, took a breath of the cool air, and howled. Not loud, not forced, just clear. The sound drifted out across the snowmelt and the spruce, rising into the dusk. For a moment, silence. Then, from somewhere near the ridge, came the reply. Thomas laughed softly, his eyes shining in the lantern light. "You still have their number, huh?" Evan grinned. "Guess they didn't forget me." They stayed there long after the forest went quiet again, just listening to the breeze, the faint trickle of water under the ice, the heartbeat of a world at peace. Over the next days, Evan explored the valley again, retracing the places his grandfather had shown him, the frozen stream, the fallen log, the ridge where he'd first seen the wolf a year before. Everywhere he went, the land felt alive with memory. He found fresh tracks by the creek, smaller than the ones he remembered, maybe pups. He smiled to himself, imagining the pack growing thriving, singing their stories into the wind. That evening, as the sun turned the snow pink and gold, he sat by the water's edge and took the pendant from his neck. It was warm from his skin. He turned it over in his hand, tracing the grooves of the carved fur, the tiny detail of its raised head mid-howl. He whispered, "Thank you." He didn't know if he was talking to his grandfather, the wolves, or the land itself. Maybe all three. Back at the cabin, Thomas was sitting by the fire reading an old journal. Evan sat beside him, the silence between them comfortable and full. After a while, Thomas closed the book. "Do you remember what I told you last winter?" Evan nodded. "That the forest talks if you listen." Thomas smiled. "And what does it say tonight?" Evan thought for a moment. The fire popped softly. The wolves had gone quiet now, but their presence still lingered, invisible, but felt. He said, "It says, we're part of it, even when we're gone." Thomas's eyes shone with pride. "You've learned the most important part. The wilderness doesn't need us to be loud. It just needs us to remember." Outside, the wind picked up gentle, carrying the faintest echo of a howl. Evan leaned back, closing his eyes. "I think it remembers us too." Later that night, when the moon was high and the forest shimmered silver, Evan stepped outside alone. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs, but the stars above burned clear and endless. He stood there for a long time listening to the quiet, the deep living quiet that he'd once feared. Then, faint but certain, a single howl rose from the valley. He didn't answer this time. He didn't need to. The sound wasn't a call for him anymore. It was a promise. A promise that the wild still lived, still spoke, still sang. He touched the pendant once more and smiled. Somewhere in that moment, he understood what his grandfather had meant when he said, "The wild doesn't speak our language, but it listens when we do." The forest had listened, and it would keep listening long after they were gone. Under the light of the moon, the howl faded into silence, but its echo stayed. In the cabin, in the valley, and in the heart of a boy who had learned to listen. The story of that winter became a quiet legend in their family, not written in books or told in classrooms, but whispered in moments of stillness when the wind brushed through the pines and the world seemed to hold its breath. Years later, when Evan grew older, he would sometimes return to the valley alone. The cabin still stood sturdy against the years. The spruce trees had grown taller. The wolves still sang at night. And every time they did, he felt the same warmth rise in his chest, the same voice that had once said, "They howl so they don't lose each other." He realized finally that his grandfather hadn't been teaching him about wolves. He'd been teaching him about people. Because we are not so different. We call across distances too through words, memories, and love. We fear what we don't understand. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply listen. The wilderness, Evan had learned, was not a place to conquer or control. It was a conversation, one that had been going on long before humans arrived and would continue long after. He thought of his grandfather's hands, rough, steady, patient, showing him how to build a fire, how to track the snow, how to listen to the rhythm of the land. Every lesson was the same message spoken in different forms. Respect is not about distance, it's about understanding. And in that understanding lives harmony. The wolves had never been monsters. They were mirrors, reflections of what humanity forgets when it stops listening guilty. Balance the power of family, the instinct to protect what we love. If you stood in that valley tonight, under the same wide sky, you might still hear them, the same lineage of howls carried down through generations. They do not belong to the past. They are alive now in every wild place that still dares to sing. And maybe if you listen closely enough, you'll realize that they're not just calling to each other. They're calling to us. Respect begins with understanding. The wild doesn't need our fear, it needs our attention. And every time we listen, instead of destroy, we keep its song alive a little longer. The camera pans wide, the forest stretching endlessly, moonlight spilling over snow and river. A distant chorus of howls begins blending with soft piano and wind. The cabin's window glows faintly in the dark, like a heartbeat in the wilderness. If this story moved, you don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel to explore true stories of wildlife and humanity, the moments where understanding changes everything. Support your local wildlife sanctuaries, conservation programs, and education efforts that protect wolves and the lands they call home. Because their voices are fading, and if we stop listening, they might never return. The screen fades to black. A final sound rises, one soft, distant howl, and then silence. Not empty, but full of meaning.